All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to my workshop. Actually, this is my lecture, but either way, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. I don't think I'm going to stand up there. I'm going to probably just stand down here and maybe pace around a little bit. So, well, again, thank you so much for coming. Tonight, what I'm going to do is go over some research with some of the topics that you might be familiar with. You've heard of terms like Planet X or Nibiru or someone named Zecharia Sitchin. So those are some of the things that I want to incorporate into the information tonight. But the main focus of what I'm going to be showing you is pretty much talking about a larger cycle of time. Now, what's really interesting about the Sitchin research, which I'm going to kind of take you through pretty thoroughly, is he was very close and on to something. But, you know, at the time of his death, being 92 years old in around 2009, you know, he wasn't the best researcher in his late years, being able to do data aggregation in his 90s. Very sharp mind, but, you know, kind of had a fade off as far as staying up to date with the current research. So in the last 10, 15 years, we've had quite a bit of advancement in our ability to peer out into the solar system, peer out into other areas of the galaxy and find solar systems that are perhaps binary in orbit. So what we've seen is quite a bit of data that shows that most of the other solar systems are binary, and so that starts to raise questions about our own solar system. So part of this information is really interesting because a lot of times we don't realize that there could be effects, astronomical effects, that actually have physical effects here on Earth. And so you've heard some of these terms like the Dark Ages or the Golden Age. If my clicker works, it's probably going to go like 4 slides, so I apologize. Okay, well, I'll ask them to help me in a minute here, but it looks like my clicker died, so. Anyways. Yeah. Sorry about that. So just give that 1 second. But pretty much what I'm boiling down to is, it's really interesting to realize that there could be astronomical effects that actually physically affect us. And so what we see is that there's possibly an astronomical cycle that actually causes a rise and fall of civilizations here on Earth. There we go. I guess it just got stuck on that slide. It's fine now. Thank you. So you've heard of terms like the Dark Ages, the Golden Age. Most people think of time as a linear event where something in the past, you know, inspired, and now we're on this progress of technology and increasing knowledge. It's very possible that we're actually on a cyclical path where we get to certain heights of our evolution in an astronomical cycle and gain knowledge that allows us to access a higher part of our brain or communicate with other beings in a higher realm. And then unfortunately, for natural reasons, we go into something called the Dark Ages and we lose all this knowledge. So it's very possible that there could actually be an astronomical reason for this cycle to take place and why we have a rise and fall of civilization. Now, this is a very new topic, but just to kind of touch on some of these so that you kind of get the idea, if you think about one of the astronomical cycles that's very easy for us to comprehend is the Earth is spinning on its axis. So you don't really think about that, but as the Earth spins on its axis, that causes day and night. And at night, right, we lose consciousness, we go to sleep. It has a physical effect on us. You don't really think about that. Cycle 2 is the Earth is going around the sun, right? So you see seasons change, plants and animals migrate. Well, plants don't migrate, but you see them change and animals migrate. And so all of that is based on an astronomical cycle. The kicker here is there's over 30 ancient cultures that believed in the idea that there were 2 suns and that there was a larger orbit that took place that actually affected our consciousness. Today we call this the precession of the equinox. So it's a very interesting term, and we're going to kind of dive into this. But as you can see from this stela, this is actually a Sumerian artifact that depicts the Tower of Babel. And at the top, you can actually see 2 suns, which is really interesting because, again, over 30 ancient cultures believed in this idea of a time system or a celestial time system that was based on astronomy. There were actually 2 MIT professors that wrote a book called Hamlet's Mill. And it's a very interesting book because it kind of records over 30 ancient cultures. We've all heard of the idea that there was once a time when we all spoke one language, then the gods came down and confused us. But what was that language? I think that language was actually an astronomical-based language, because all around the world, on every continent, there's evidence that cultures had this advanced astronomical information and data, and we don't really know where it comes from. So it's very possible that they were actually given this information, or that, again, it's been around from a much larger cycle of time. So you can see that same stela, again, the actual rendition of it in kind of a clay form. Now, hopefully this will play a video. We'll give it a moment and see. So here's kind of the idea that's really the kicker about a binary solar system, is if you think about it, if the sun has a companion, that means they're in orbit around each other. That changes the whole idea of our solar system, perhaps not just being static, but actually moving through space. If you think about it, if our sun is orbiting another sun, all the planets around the sun are going along for a ride. So we've never really considered the idea until recently that our model for a solar system is actually moving. And so up until now, mainstream science has considered the precession of the equinox based on what they call this lunar solar wobble. And they calculate all these, like, over 1,000 variables to try and figure out motion and torque. And it turns out that there's a much more simple reason for the precession of the equinox if you incorporate a binary orbit. So there's a lot of different research out there kind of showing the idea that it does make more sense to explain why every 2,000 years we go through what's called a new age. You've seen it broken down into 12 ages, 12 different constellations. But these last about 2,000 years, and up until now it's never been thought of as the sun actually moving, but it is. So that's what's actually changing our perspective of every 2,000 years seeing a new constellation. So we've all kind of heard of this information that the ancients basically broke down the heavens into 12 constellations as a large celestial clock. And we go through these ages that, again, last around 2,000 years. So if there's 12 of these every 2,000 years, you're looking at a 24,000-year cycle. Now, modern day or mainstream science calculates precession, again, slightly different, and they say it's a little over 25,000 years. But they're not incorporating the idea of a binary orbit. And so if you incorporate two suns orbiting each other, as they get closer, they speed up, and as they get farther away, they slow down. So the mean average of their orbit is around 2,000 years. Now, where this comes into play is that, again, there's cultures all around the world that not only do they share similar building styles, making megaliths and pyramids, but they've also shared this astronomical knowledge of a cycle of time. Meaning you can go to any continent around the world, and they either have understandings of this cycle in word form, or they have attributed it towards a symbol, like a scorpion and the bull and various other constellation symbols that we've attributed it to. But what you can see here is that there's an ascending age and a descending age, and that's really the important part. If we look at the cycle of time that we're already aware of now, it's 2017, so we're roughly, let's just say, 2,000 years removed from the BC to AD mark, right? So if you go back to AD BC mark and go back another 2,000 years, you'll find that the architecture and the knowledge in southern Iraq, which was then Sumer, or in High Egypt, you see this amazing architecture, this amazing understanding of astronomy. And then what happens is we kind of descend into the Dark Ages, and yes, it's very much like the Game of Thrones, and we forget everything and don't have any understanding. But then we come out of this and enter the Renaissance age and relearn a lot of the things that we knew well into the past. And again, this points to a cyclical path of knowledge where a lot of the things that we seem to have had in the very, very distant past, we can trace to these high ancient cultures in Egypt and their amazing knowledge, and can't figure out why they started to descend and lose all this information. I think it's because, again, there is this larger cycle of time. And if you think about us having two suns, and that mean average of their orbit being 2,000 years, what we have is a solution to kind of explain this cycle, where we have 12,000 years where we're essentially coming out of the Dark Ages into the next Golden Age. And we're probably about 8,000 years until the next Golden Age, so we're still quite a while, according to the main philosophy, again, of over 30 ancient cultures. But if you see, we've gone through this cycle where there's 12,000 years where we descend into the Dark Ages. So we're now on the ascending path, coming back up. But again, we're only about 2,000 years just coming out of the Bronze Age once again. So some very interesting information when we look at this at a cyclical type of story. Now, what's really interesting is that there's been several researchers, most of them non-US, that have started to realize that there's cycles taking place, astronomical cycles, that actually do affect on us. This researcher was actually looking at the propensity of wars to take place based on solar activity, so that there was certain types of aggression level that were higher during certain solar cycles. Now, if you think about the suns actually having an effect on us, you know how just one sun affects you, right? Everyone loves sunshine. Summertime, we go outside and it gets us full of energy. And then when the sun goes down, we slow down and go to sleep. Now, what if for some reason during our golden age, the effects of two suns just do something even more to us? We're able to experience or tap into senses that we don't fully understand. It's a hard concept for us to comprehend, but a lot of the data is starting to show us that there are magnetic field and various things that are affecting us based on either solar radiation or the movements of the planets. Look at how the moon even affects our tides and various things. So we don't consider the fact that it can have a physical effect on us as well. I have a business partner named Walter Cruttenden who's produced a very good video called The Great Year. It's now on YouTube. You can just type in The Great Year. It's narrated by James Earl Jones, which is Darth Vader, if you're a fan of that as well. Great video, but also kind of boils down what I'm trying to express to you tonight. So it's very esoteric information, but good stuff. Now, a lot of cultures, again, have this legacy of information based on astronomy, and some of it is very esoteric. Some of it even is intertwined into their understandings of how they cross into the next life and view the afterlife, being connected to the heavens. I always found a lot of the Egyptian artwork very interesting as they kind of visualize and encapsulate some of these thoughts. But what we see is that many of these cultures, especially High Egypt, had very advanced astronomical information, and they were able to record movements of the heavens and views of the heavens in a much more expanded format than we currently understand. This is actually in a crypt called Dendera, and on the ceiling is this relief. Here it is in actuality of what it looks like in detail. Now, what's really interesting about this relief is it's a view of the sky over Egypt from around 8000 BC. So you have to wonder, how were they able to depict the sky of Egypt thousands of years before, when they weren't even supposed to be there? Egyptian culture kind of thriving around 2500 BC. A lot of their astronomical information has views of the sky captured in some way that pinpoints their culture being thousands of years in a previous state. Was this because they were in their golden age at that time? We'll look at some other points from Egyptians' ability to use astronomical markers to give us references for time. But the Dendera relief is very interesting because it's extremely detailed, and we've been able to pinpoint what time frame they're actually showing the skies over Egypt, and it's, again, over 8,000 years. Now, again, the Mayans and the Aztecs, again, were kind of known for their amazing astronomical information. The Mayans had 3 different calendars. One of them I paid most attention to, I thought was interesting, was called the long count calendar, and they had these predictions called baktuns, and some of them were actually very accurate. One of them predicted that at this certain time frame that their god Kukulkan would return, and unfortunately it coincided with the same time of the conquistadors showing up from Spain. So these beautiful ships show up on the shores of the Mayan beaches, and the Mayans are like, wow, it's our gods, and throw gold and women and everything at them. And what happens? The conquistadors burn everything and aggressively convert them to Christianity. So we only have 4 codices left, but their information, again, based on astronomical data, it's very accurate and very in-depth. Some of these sites, even around the world, are very crude in nature. This is in Egypt, And this, again, was used as a marker to be able to kind of navigate things happening in the summer and winter solstice time markers and watching the movements of the heavens, even with very rudimentary implementation. Now, some of these did get more complex, and again, they all kind of serve the same purpose, which is to use these to watch the movements of the heavens and to analyze when these repeating patterns would be taking place. A lot of these stars or things that they were paying attention to sometimes were connected to the process of the afterlife, or what happens as a pharaoh or a king has to prepare themselves for the afterlife. Now, a lot of these cultures actually had astronomical information that we can't even explain. This is from the Dogon tribe, and they're aware of the Sirius star system, which has actually two suns, Sirius A and B, but they have no aided technology. They're very primitive, and they've been able to identify the Orion constellation and Sirius A and B extremely accurately, completely cut off from technology and still living in a very basic state today. Yet they've obtained this astronomical information. So when we think about some of the data that they're telling us, it really does start to point to the idea that there could be the best companion that we have for our twin sun. A lot of these ancient cultures seem to point to certain constellations, Orion. Now, that's not really a star system that we would call a twin, but Sirius A and B very possibly could be essentially our twin sun, and us being in some kind of dual orbit. Now, as I get into some of these slides, you're going to see a lot of the information about Planet X. What's really interesting is that mainstream science continues to acknowledge sources of gravitational pull in the solar system. Sedna, Quoar, Xena, these various little planetoids are things that they discover, and they're saying, it's influencing a gravitational pull on our inner planets. There's still something out there that we haven't located as a Planet X. They're not considering that it's not a planet, but another star system. So they have yet to latch onto the idea that these gravitational anomalies that we see could be based on another star, not a planet. Again, so a lot of the Aboriginal information around the world, this is, I believe, some of the stuff in Australia, you see a lot of these beings and various things being recorded that speak to some type of translation taking place where we've been given information in some form, whether it's in spirit form or in physical form, but it's valid astronomical information. So these are kind of petroglyphs all over the wall, and some of them depict some very interesting beings. Now, as I mentioned, this is a 24,000-year orbit when I talk about this cycle of time. So 24,000 years is not something that's easy for us to comprehend. We only live 100 years, so 24,000 years. So as an example, there's an insect called the mayfly, and it only lives 24 hours. So if a mayfly is sitting on a leaf on a cloudy, windless day, another mayfly comes up, and he's like, I've heard of this stuff called sunshine or breeze. I don't see it. And they both die. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means that their lifespan didn't allow them to experience it. So when we hear about these things about the golden age or the dark ages, it's hard for us to comprehend. But if you think about it and look at all the monuments around the world, they weren't built to fight off warring factions or to protect their culture. They were observing the heavens. Every single monument was built to be observing the heavens, peacefully too, I would add. So as again, I mentioned kind of some of these things that have happened in the past. Copernicus, Galileo, all this had to be rewritten when we thought initially that the Earth was literally the center of the solar system. When we relearned what the ancients have been telling us for a long time about our solar system, and that obviously we're orbiting the sun. But as you'll see, a lot of this information was recorded thousands of years ago by the Sumerian culture, very accurately, well before Copernicus and Galileo rediscovering it. A lot of the Sumerian artifacts like to use semi-precious stones. You can see here that this is actually, let's see if I got a laser. Oh, right. So some of these are little constellation symbols that you can see, their knowledge of the heavens. They had various ways of imprinting information. This one I just thought was a very interesting pressed seal because it's actually showing Earth, the 7 dots of Earth, and our crescent moon, and then the symbol for Nibiru and its moon. So I always thought that was kind of neat. Now, the Sumerians are an interesting culture because they come right out of the Stone Age. There's no precursor civilization to them, yet they have a language that's so complex called cuneiform script. It had over 400 characters. We think we're cool with our 26-letter alphabet. Here we are with 400 characters as one of the first languages on Earth. Now, they, again, sometimes would use semi-precious stones, and they would use something that looked like an oversized screwdriver. It would kind of twizzle and twist it into wet clay or stone and write the language. A lot of these tablets contain astronomical information, and some of these would track the movements of the heavens hundreds, sometimes even over 1,000 years, where high priests would hand this down as sacred knowledge to interpret the information. So a Sumerian priest could tell you 50 years in advance on one specific day when there would be a lunar eclipse or a solar eclipse, and would share this again as sacred knowledge, passing it on to the priests. You've all seen Mel Gibson's, perhaps, Apocalypto, and this scene kind of plays out where the priest, not the king, the priest knows that there's about to be the eclipse, looks over at the king and says, all right, do your thing, and then they cut the guy's head off. But the fact is that the priest had the information. It's always passed down as sacred astronomical data. Now, there's still hundreds of these tablets in the Louvre, in the British Museum, sitting in the archives, untranslated. We probably need some grants or people to come in there with some linguists, translators, and further interpret a lot of this data. There could be healing plants or more information that could be revealed by, again, looking through the archives of these probably over 100,000 tablets that are still left untranslated. Now, why I became first intrigued by the Sumerian information is I was raised as a Christian, and a lot of the things that we heard about, like giants upon the earth, there was once a time when man lived amongst his living gods. As a child, I didn't really understand a lot of this information, but as I grew up and started to become aware of many world cultures, the Sumerian culture is a very interesting piece because it could possibly be speaking of the time talked about in the Old Testament and New Testament when certain cultures lived amongst their living gods. And a lot of the Sumerian information is really a kick to the head, because if you were to ask a Sumerian man, how do you know all this information? They tell you, everything we know we were taught by the Anunnaki. And that term meant those who from heaven come to earth. And so a lot of times you see these depictions of the Anunnaki either seated and they're much larger beings, or there's some exchange of knowledge happening between these beings and humanity. But the more overwhelming relief that we see is that they had the power of flight. So all over Iraq and all over Iran, we see these depictions. And this is pre-biblical understandings of angels, but the same idea that there was some source of knowledge that is coming down and greeting us and giving us this information to us. Now, a lot of times, this relief is kind of shown over and over in different scenes. But I kind of make a joke, too, that you see over and over that there's this scene where a king is greeting one of the gods coming down. And the taxpayers are holding up the platform to make that happen. But jokingly not, you do see that there's this relief shown over and over, all over sacred sites, where this interaction with the gods was, again, a celebrated event and was supported by the people. Here we go in Iran and Persepolis. So what's really interesting about this symbology to me is that they're showing some very interesting things. One, many have pointed out, again, he's holding the cone, which could be the symbol of a pineal gland, knowledge, source of life. This also, perhaps the water of life. People have commented this looks very similar and eerie to a wristwatch. But what I like to point out is just the overall dress is the power of flight. And if we think that that's not symbolically telling you the power of flight, well, then look at this. Because when we landed a man on the moon, I hope that 200 years from now, they're not going to look at this and go, what were they doing putting birds on the moon? No, that's not the case. We were using this to symbolically say we had the power of flight. So we kind of all remember this famous landing, and it's muted, but there was the only audio I have is, obviously, remember this, it's Houston, the Eagle has landed. So, again, these terminology and things, while they might seem far-fetched, the symbolic reference to them do hold ground when we look at a lot of the other references for the idea of the power of flight. Now, as I mentioned, several of these Sumerian tablets had this astronomical data, and very accurately recorded over hundreds, even thousands of years, knowledge and movements of the heavens. Some of these tablets are still preserved in museums around the world. And again, they were held by astronomer priests and passed down as sacred information. And a lot of this knowledge was actually bequeathed directly from a god. So a Sumerian priest would sit there, and there'd be a scribe where his trained profession was to read and write Sumerian cuneiform script. And essentially a god would dictate knowledge to the priest, and the priest would just sit there and take that in while the scribe would record all the information. I'd love to sit in a few of those sessions if they're... So again, we have a lot of these tablets. Many of these are sacred texts. You've all heard of the story that, that God created, the whole thing in 7 days, and that we have this story in English, but there's actually a much expanded version on these tablets of creation, where there's several tablets of creation that give you a much more expanded view in this Enuma Elish, where in the English version, where we have God's story of creation, in the Sumerian version, it's a much more expanded version that talks about cosmology and movements in the solar system. So what's really interesting about, as we start to get into the Sumerian astronomical information, is, when we first started to translate and look at these tablets in the early 1900s, we haven't even visited the outer solar systems. It wasn't until Voyager, Galileo, late 70s, early 80s, we send probes to the outer planets, and what do you know? They confirm Sumerian descriptions, the distance between the planets, what the planets actually look like physically in space, seeing that they're bluish green, mosh sieg, Sumerian terms to match what we actually find out when we send our probes out there. So over and over, we find this astronomical data, and there's always this reference of this glowing cross for a reference to this planet called Nibiru as the home world of these gods they called Anunnaki. Nibiru simply meant planet of the crossing, and so you see it depicted over and over as this cross in many of their depictions. And we can see a natural evolution, too, of some of these figures coming from other cultures, especially Egypt, Ra and other gods, and this ability to kind of trace this idea that the same symbolic references of Nibiru have been filtered into other cultures, kind of the idea of this flying disc and various other references. You can see here is a plowing scene during the day, and we actually have the sun and then this glowing cross where they're actually looking up in awe in awareness of it. Here's again that pressed symbol of Nibiru, where you can see the 7 dots of Earth and our crescent moon, and Nibiru, the symbol of its cross and its moon. Now, again, some of these tablets still exist, and they give us a much more expanded view. There's actually in the British Museum, I might come back to it, it's called the Flood Tablet. So when they were doing excavations in Iraq, there was an assistant to the curator of the British Museum in the late 1800s, and he finds this one tablet, starts kind of translating it, and it was in Akkadian, but they actually found earlier versions in Sumerian script as well. But he had an Akkadian version, and he's reading it, and he realizes, my God, this is telling us the same story as Noah's Ark, but it's in this Sumerian script, or this Akkadian script. And so he literally threw his hands up and ran out of the room, freaking out because he was so amazed. So a lot of the information that we've been able to validate on the Sumerian information kind of shows that biblical tales in some form are based on fact. Now, what we have with this Sumerian cosmological information is more of an expanded view and understanding for how our solar system came into being. And it's a very eloquent story that actually scientifically holds up. The Sumerian information explains that when our solar system was still in its very early form, the planets hadn't even finished coalescing. They weren't solid mass. An intruder planet shows up and has a collision with one of our primitive planets, then called Tiamat, and eventually called Earth. So there was a huge planetary collision. And what's interesting is that Zecharia Sitchin did a very good job of trying to decipher the Sumerian understanding and making these visual diagrams, which anyone who's been on the internet in the last 15 years looking at Planet X or Nibiru might be familiar with some of this information. But the story basically explains that this planet Nibiru gets caught by the gravitational pull of our outer planets and gets sucked into the inner part of the solar system. And eventually, on one of its successive orbits, the main moon, which is labeled here Northwind, hits our primitive Earth and then in that process moves Earth into its current orbit and strews out what we now know as the asteroid belt. The hammered bracelet is what the Bible refers it to. So then Planet X goes on to have this long elliptical orbit, as Sitchin's diagram shows, and he's basing this because on the amount of years that it would take for the orbit to be complete, he calculated it to be around 3,600 years. So that's a very long orbit. But he theorized that, again, it would have to have this elongated orbit because it's somehow coming back into the solar system every few thousand years. Now, a lot of the information that he used to support his claims were very interesting visuals because you could see here, this is actually a stela that's a god granting man the plow, modern agriculture. But you can see as a backdrop what looks like could be interpreted as modern-day rocket, even between the silo, as if these two arms kind of fall off and the rocket blasts up. And then above, what we see is an accurate representation of our solar system with the sun in the center. Now again, Copernicus, Galileo, they relearned this information, yet here it is depicted accurately thousands of years ago. So we have to wonder about the Sumerian information's validity and understanding that their information and how they depicted our knowledge is quite interesting in that they called Earth the seventh planet. We've all heard of 7 days in a week, 7 days of creation, the 7 tablets of creation, the sacred number 7. So if you're actually coming from outside the solar system in, you'd actually pass by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and we're on the 7th planet, not the third rock from the sun like the TV show would tell you. And here's just kind of an artist's rendition to explain the fact that Zecharia Sitchin's model counted the 9 planets that we know of, our sun, our moon, and then Nibiru. Now, what he also was able to find was 2 interesting collaborating pieces of data here about the Sumerian knowledge base. One is, no one believed that in the Sumerian times they had knowledge of the wheel, if you can believe that. And he's like, well, here's a circular tablet. I don't understand what you're saying. And a lot of these things actually, when translated, revealed some very interesting information. This section alone, he went on to translate. Oh, I'm sorry, those words didn't come out. This section alone went on to translate where along the edges it's saying rocket, rocket mountain, pile up, high, high, high. And you can see here that it actually shows basically the path and the number of planets one would have to pass before they arrived at the mountainous planet Earth. So it's kind of a very interesting stela that he was actually translating, showing that they had navigational charts showing how they would actually get and arrive to planet Earth. So if you think about this idea that there was this large collision right in the past and some large body whacks our planet, strewing out the asteroid belt, that would pretty much leave us with half a planet. Now if you think about that, that's exactly what we have. The idea that the continents, like the skin of an apple, the continents were all connected as one landmass. And every planet just goes into spherical form. But if you suck off all the water, essentially you're looking at half a planet. So that's a very interesting cosmological lineup to what the Sumerian descriptions say for this large collision in our past, kind of explaining why we've all been taught that, it's interesting that all the continents seem to fit together somehow. That can explain it. Was at one point in time it was one large landmass and a huge chunk of the planet was missing. So we've all heard this idea of a great flood. I'm going to grab some water up here for a sec. And, you know, this is an interesting topic. I don't think I can do this at the same time, sorry. We've got these maps that have shown up all over the Earth, and they show the topography of the Earth at a time when all the continents were probably still connected. And what's interesting about that is they give you in depth kind of what the animals are that are roaming in those different continents, the various ship paths that they took. And it wasn't even believed that there was transoceanic exchange taking place, yet various maps, the Peri-Reis map, this one, the Phineas map, also show, again, accurate topography even underneath the ice of Antarctica, which means, there's a mile-thick layer of ice covering the land. So to have accurate maps showing the land and not the ice, how would you do that unless you have ground-penetrating radar? How were they able to be high enough above our Earth to accurately map everything if no one was flying in the skies of the Earth at those times? So this is all based on earlier knowledge and was, again, pretty important knowledge to navigational reasons. So I mentioned this one earlier, but this is an actual tablet that's stored on display in the British Museum as the flood tablet. And so to validate some of the biblical information, we have to realize that there are artifacts and information that kind of shed light on some of these locations and events. And the more we look into it from not just, let's say, the New King James Version in English or just the Old Testament in Hebrew, there are earlier versions that expand on some of these events, kind of trying to understand if there was some worldwide cataclysmic event that could have affected change here on Earth. Now, recently, there was and I'm sorry that doesn't play, I apologize, but this would have been a video that basically recently showed up on the Discovery Channel for a theory called the Orpheus Theory. And what it basically shows is this large intruder planet comes in and whacks our Earth, and the debris coalesces into our moon. Very similar to what we have in the Sumerian epoch of knowledge. So a lot of the things that we have now as a crossover between this idea of a Sumerian planet X, known as Nibiru, is there's an influx of modern research trying to explain a lot of orbital anomalies with our solar system. And they kind of point to the idea that there's another planet in our solar system. So for many years, there's been a lot of research in the idea that we have these extrasolar planets or these other bodies that are on these odd orbits, and we're trying to understand their placement in the solar system. And we didn't even realize that a planet could have an egg-shaped or a elongated orbit until we found this, a very simple one little planet going around its star, not our solar system, but it's on an elliptical orbit. It's taken by the Hubble telescope. So it kind of proved the idea that, yes, stars can have planets that are on elongated or elliptical orbits. We've had a lot of theories put out to explain our solar system model. This was put forth by a gentleman named Dr. Tom Van Flanderen. Tom Van Flanderen passed away several years ago. I was fortunate to literally do the last lecture he gave as a debate on the Planet X model. So I have mad respect for Dr. Tom Van Flanderen. And he wrote a book called The Exploded Planet Hypothesis. Basically, he believed the idea of a Planet X, but that it exploded. And so that if you look at all the planets, you see our moon, Jupiter, lots of evidence of massive debris hitting the planets. And so one of his ideas is that maybe Nibiru exploded at some point in the past. I don't subscribe to that idea, but just go ahead and put that out there. Now, what we've done is over the last 20 years have deployed many different space telescopes that are allowing us a new way to peer into space, much deeper and much higher resolution. Another interesting thing I'd point out is this is from an Encyclopedia Britannica. I believe it was a 1983 sighting here, where in this depiction of our Pioneer 10 probe, wouldn't you know it, they depict a twin sun, and then our sun has basically a companion that's out there 10 billion miles. Now, we've all heard of some of these terms, like the Oort cloud and various things. Oort cloud being another debris, like an asteroid belt of debris far beyond Pluto. And so there are hints in our knowledge base that we actually do have a twin sun and that there is a companion planet that's been orbiting for quite some time, into the fact that some of our other countries have even embedded it into their currency as knowledge, which I thought was kind of interesting. So where this really became on the radar was in the early 90s by Zecharia Sitchin, who wrote a book called The 12th Planet. And in his book, he went on camera where he met with the lead astronomer for the Naval Observatory, who had recorded several astronomical plates that he thought of as the location of where this planet would be. And so Zecharia Sitchin actually went, and I think I'll come back in a minute. Maybe I've passed it. I apologize. We'll see if it pops up. But basically, Zecharia Sitchin went on camera with Dr. Harrington and compared their two models and showed that they're very accurate in reference. So we have a lot of these telescopes out there now that are able to see things and get data at a much more expanded rate. We recently launched a satellite called CERTIF, and I apologize that I'm having some problems with some of my videos, but the CERTIF telescope basically is super, super advanced, and it was recently renamed after an astronomer who passed away. It's called Spitzer telescope now. But basically what the Spitzer telescope can do is there's been limitations to some of the satellites being able to peer through these dust clouds. So they get to a certain point in space, and then there's this large field of debris. So what these things do is they sit out there at a temperature of below zero, if you can want to believe this. And what happens is they can look at this dust cloud and see what temperature it's at, and essentially tune the telescope to the temperature and see right through it. So we're producing these images that are giving us a much more expanded view of the heavens with a much more clearer set of data. And what we're starting to see is that there's a lot of these exoplanets. Here's a Jupiter-sized planet, here's our sun. But in between, there's various other large bodies that we're starting to understand that could exist. It's very possible, for instance, that our companion sun is now one of these brown dwarfs or a failed sun. It's not a super bright object anymore, but it still has gravitational mass. Now, we have several observatories around the world. This is the Keck Interferometer in Hawaii, and what it's able to do is actually focus two lenses at a point in space and get more or less a three-dimensional image of the star. It's very interesting. So over the last decade now or so, 15 years even, we have all of these news releases continually coming out saying there's some new object that they've been filming or something that they've detected beyond our own 9 planets, and that there's some other planet out there that all the evidence is pointing to does exist. Over and over, these various articles pointing to the idea that there's some mystery planet that we have yet to discover. So if any of you have been following this, basically all the planets they've been finding have been basically little snowballs of ice. They're like, 800 to 1,000 miles or 1,000 kilometers in circumference. They're nowhere near the size of Earth, or potential Nibiru, as cited by the Sumerians, was 4 to 8 times the size of Earth. Pretty good sized planet. If anything like that comes anywhere near the inner solar system, we're most likely going to see it. So again, there was this Sumerian knowledge of this 10th planet, and again, it very much lines up with a lot of the astronomical data where they're looking for a 10th planet, and this seems to overlap with what the Sumerians have put forth. And unfortunately, it doesn't look like my videos are playing, but this would have been Zecharia Sitchin meeting with Dr. Harrington at the Naval Observatory. I think I have a shot of what they're looking at. Oop, there we go. You can see here's Sitchin's model of this elongated orbit, and Dr. Harrington's orbit. Again, this is three-dimensional space, so his extends up rather than to the side. But again, it's the same model predicting the idea that there's this large planet that we have yet to understand. And Dr. Harrington was confirming the idea that pretty much all the orbital anomalies we see in our solar system, why Neptune and Pluto could have been possibly dislodged moons of Saturn, Uranus being tilted on its side, just a lot of the things raise questions. And by just including one planet having this disruptive motion explains a lot of our solar system anomalies. Zecharia Sitchin wrote a series of books called the Earth Chronicles. Again, while this is kind of legacy information, it is very exciting. And I would recommend you at least pick up the 12th planet and get a basis for some of that knowledge, because he did hit on a lot of pertinent information where it wasn't just the Sumerian culture. You can see how this permeated into other cultures as well. Now, what's really interesting, too, is some of this notion or idea about a threat from space, whether it be a Planet X or possibly some type of extinction-level event. I apologize that none of my videos are playing. what's interesting to note is that there has been a lot of data and information put forward to predict the idea that there is solar system events that could have an effect on us. Again, this would have been a video, but basically what I'm showing here is Shoemaker-Levy 9 and the impacts that it had. This was a large comet that broke up into 9 pieces and impacted Jupiter. And while this was taking place, amateur astronomers around the world were watching, and NASA said, don't even worry about it. Don't even bother. It's not going to be anything interesting. So each one of these can fit 4 to 8 Earths in just that little mass. So these were extremely large explosions that we recorded, and it kind of showed the idea that, again, there are the possibilities for some large cataclysmic event. And unfortunately, what we see is that, looking at this idea of a large cycle of time, while we were in potentially the last golden age 12,000 years ago, it might have also coincided with some large cataclysmic event, too. So it's kind of the yin and yang, get the good with the bad. And so I don't fully understand that part, but there has been a significant amount of data that shows that there are cyclical events. Dr. Mueller predicted this nemesis star orbiting our sun, and that it would periodically cross into this Oort cloud, and every few million years would dislodge debris and bring it to the inner part of the solar system. And that's what the downfall of the dinosaurs and various things suffered, was this kind of cyclical debris coming in from outer space. So again, a lot of the data that we have is allowing us to peer much further into the universe, getting a clearer view. It's very possible that if there is a planet X or some large object within our lifetime, we will discover it. You will see that they continue to find structures out there. The Dyson megastructure recently that was imaged, the idea that we have planets that we're now starting to see that are potentially Earth-like planets. I have faith that in our lifetime, if there is a planet X, we will see it. But as far as it being a destructive force, that's not something I'm too worried about. We can see that there is quite a bit of data to show that we could possibly have some type of companion star. And there's been various theories. This one's called the Nemesis theory, again showing that there's this star called Nemesis around our sun in some longer orbital period. So the idea of that planet X, I think, is going to continue to come up. But I would stress to you that maybe it's not a planet. Maybe these effects are actually caused by a twin sun. But our science hasn't yet considered that fact yet. So again, a lot of this that we see evidence for a planet X, all these little things that they've been finding are not really the planet X size quoted by the Sumerians of 4 to 8 times the size of Earth. That would be a much larger planet. If you just wait until the end, and I'll answer any questions. So we just have to wonder if they do actually find something like that. I don't think it's going to be a cover-up or anything that they can hide. A lot of people think that there's like a planet X cover-up, something 4 to 8 times the size of the Earth. We have so many amateur astronomers watching things. Shoemaker-Levy 9, Hale-Bopp, all of these were seen by astronomers in an amateur level and then escalated to the professional community. So have faith that our technology will see something coming in at that level of a threat, because again, when I talk about Planet X, it's not my main focus these days, but over the last 10 years, there's been so much misinformation about it hiding behind the sun or that it's going to kill us next year. I don't subscribe to that idea. Again, SIRTIF, being able to peer into the solar system, I apologize, this is a little out of order. This is kind of the visible light range of what we were normally able to see. Using SIRTIF, all those little red dots are potential suns with planets around them. So a lot of data that we're now starting to get. And my Orpheus video still doesn't play. I apologize. Okay, so now another key thing to think about here when we look at a lot of these ancient sites is how to date them properly. There's a lot of controversy over a lot of these sites, especially the ones you see on shows like Ancient Aliens. A lot of these megalithic structures have architecture and mathematics built into them, and it starts to raise questions around their dating because the culture at that time has no knowledge of the architecture, or the math, or the astronomy to explain a lot of these sites. So I want to give you guys some hints on how to possibly look at some of these sites from a layman's perspective and present possibly a more accurate way of looking at dating. Now, we all remember a time that if you look in the stories of ancient Egypt, they talk about the pharaohs being able to pretty much come right down the pyramid and be at the banks of the Nile. Unfortunately, today, if you look on Google Maps, you can see that the Nile has meandered far away from where the pyramids are, many, many miles away. So this is the Nile, there's the pyramids. There's geological evidence to show that the Nile's meandering, it's probably taken thousands of years to move in that fashion, away from the foot, being right at the foot of the pyramids. So again, we can use geological evidence to see changes that have probably been taking place over thousands of years. This is true with many cultures where, again, all over Peru and some of these Bolivia and various cultures have these cultures embedded with water and the idea that they were very much close to water. Unfortunately, when you look on a map today and you look at some of these sites, like Cusco, Machu Picchu, some of these sites are, they think it's such a high elevation and they can't explain that. But again, geologically, if you look at like Lake Titicaca and understand, well, this ancient shoreline would have shown Machu Picchu and some of these literally right on the shore, right on an ancient shoreline, which makes sense. We all love waterfront property, but we're not understanding or taking into consideration some of these geological changes. Now, if you combine the geological changes with astronomical alignments all over the world that have been embedded into these monuments, you start to get a clear idea of some of the dates. Egypt is a perfect example. If you look at the 3 pyramids of Giza, they basically are forming a terrestrial map of the Orion constellation. So you can use any type of star charting software on your iPad, just download Redshift, various programs, and then it'll tell you where the stars are going to be in the heavens at what time. So you could essentially say, oh, well, Orion's going to be in my front yard tomorrow night. Great. But you can also roll back the clock, and it turns out at 10,500 BC, the Orion constellation is forming a terrestrial map of the Giza Plateau. 10,500 BC. What we also see is that the Sphinx is gazing directly into the constellation of Leo, which is a lion. So somehow, for whatever reason, the Giza complex was built as a terrestrial alignment at 10,500 BC. So again, you have to incorporate that knowledge. And if you, and I'm not sure if I have a slide of this, but if you actually go to the Sphinx, the inner walls of the Sphinx have been inundated with water, massive rain or water, and there's no way to explain that type of water erosion other than rain, and a lot of it. The last time it was raining on the plateaus of Giza was probably 10,000 years ago to that scale. So again, a lot of this geological as well as astronomical data for these sites can give us a clearer picture. Now, a lot of these sites, again, have astronomical information embedded in them in such a way that allows us to track this cycle of time. It's a repeating set of events. The winter solstice, the summer solstice, all these things, again, taking place on astronomical movements. The ancients went to a great deal to record this and watch these for a reason. Stonehenge is a great example, of course, kind of memorializing these changes. And the idea that, in the golden age, if there is this energy, some type of natural essence that makes us in a higher state, and then we descend into the dark ages and lose this, it seems as if a lot of these sites were trying to harness this energy or somehow be aware of it and somehow, understand how it tapped into our daily lives. A lot of these sites, again, were built to track this cycle using very basic forms of formations of stones in the ground, but a very complex way of looking at change that happened over thousands of years. So as I mentioned, it seems that a lot of these sites are built at geodetic points on the Earth that are harnessing something called an ancient world energy grid. We don't fully understand this, but we know that there's a subtle energy at a lot of these locations, and it's very possible, perhaps the pyramid and various other sites, were actually utilizing or trying to harness this energy. One of the theories I put forth is if there was some natural thing taking place in the Golden Age, maybe what happens is these monuments were like tapping into that, and as we would descend into the Dark Ages, we would use these monuments to somehow keep that energy alive as long as we could, kind of trying to hold on to the Golden Age as long as we could. But all around the world, every single site that we see is based on astronomical movements. They use these locations to monitor the heavens. Over and over, that's all we see is an advanced understanding of astronomy and a tracking and movements of the heavens. And some of these were actually celebrated in very momentous ways. You can see here in this culture, which used very similar styles to Egypt as far as pyramids, but they embedded knowledge where they built a certain alignment that would take place so that on certain times you would actually see a shadow take place where the serpent god Kukulkan would be depicted literally appearing coming down the stairs. And that all takes place simply because the sun hits the pyramid at a ceremonial time. And again, this is a celebrated event. Cyclical, it happens in a cyclical fashion. So we have to understand that there are astronomical movements that the ancients were very aware of, and again, celebrated them in very momentous ways. And all around the world, we have cultures that have recorded astronomical data. These are some texts from Saudi Arabia and various other cultures that have recorded either Celtic understandings on metal plates of some of the various constellations. All around the world, they went to great lengths recording this astronomical data as sacred information. And that was probably a really cool video. Oh, looks like that was the end. Interesting. Let me make sure I got to my last slide there. It just stopped the PowerPoint, so. Well, if that was the last one, I can still kind of go on for a couple of minutes. And I apologize that they gave me 2 hours tonight because really I only was going to speak for an hour. Okay, well, that's okay. So what I'll do is just kind of take a few minutes to answer any questions. And the basic thing that I wanted to convey tonight was the idea that, Sitchin's model for a single sun, there is an expanded idea there when we look at the idea that we have a binary orbit. And I encourage all of you to watch that video, The Great Year. You can also Google the term Binary Research Institute and learn more about this binary orbit theory. Thank you very much, and I'll go ahead and take a few questions. Yes, sir, go ahead. Oh, okay.
My astronomy teacher tells me that the closest star to us is Andromeda, and she's convinced that extraterrestrials or whoever with advanced technology can't travel because of the light years and the distance. My question to you is, do you think that dark matter and dark energy is kind of like something that aliens tapped into? That they're using like quantum mechanics to travel? What is your thought on that?
Well, that's a good question. Yes. I mean, I have no real knowledge, obviously, of advanced propulsion, but I'll give you guys an analogy, and some of you have probably heard of this. There's a lot of ways to explain exotic propulsion, and I know that we've got a lot further than they've told us. And maybe you've heard the story of Bob Lazar and his foray into Area 51. The one key point that he brought out of that information to make this very simple to understand was he explained that on the craft that he was reverse engineering, there were 3 independent rods hanging in the lower level, and they called them gravity amplifiers. And so essentially these 3 gravity amplifiers could be swung in any direction to help move the craft in any way that they wanted to go. And in standard propulsion, you'd think of an engine with rocket power and thrust. He explained that these craft actually would take these 3 gravity amplifiers and would focus them at one specific point in front of the vehicle and create essentially a gravity well so intense that the craft is being sucked into gravity exponentially. And traveling like that, it's easy for the mind to understand. So to your question, I'd say that there's probably a lot of advanced propulsions and things that are not on our current public radar. But again, if it's explained to us and put into layman's terms, I don't understand how my car works. I love cars. I can drive my car very efficiently, but if you crack open the hood and I look in there, I can't explain it to you. I think it's the same thing with exotic propulsion. I'd love for some of that to get introduced into the public sector. I don't think it's that far-fetched for us to understand. Yes, sir.
You answered my question when you said you don't subscribe to Nibiru being here now. But I've seen some pretty convincing-looking YouTube videos that show that it is here and it is casting shadows. but so that's all a hoax.
So my opinion on this, I'll be very frank, is, I've been looking into it for over a decade. And, when this first came out, there were a couple people that were promoting this. One lady's name was Nancy Leader, and she was channeling aliens. And she went to great lengths explaining all this information. So I did a live debate with her on the air. And my simple question to her as she was channeling the aliens and giving these very interesting answers, I said, without hesitation, just like you've answered everything else, tell me, what's 276 divided by 497? Go! Or something like that, right? And she was like, pause, live on the air. And her response was, Nancy is not able to translate this information because her brain works at a certain speed, blah, 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 blah. My point is that live on the air, with asked an actual math question, if she was relaying answers from aliens, it would have been very simple to answer, and she wasn't able to do that. And so that's how I've approached anything with the topic of Planet X. If someone has something to say and they have data to put forth, I'd like to challenge them directly, and I've never found anything that stands up for me that shows there's a Planet X hovering behind the sun. But if there is anything convincing, please email me at jason@xfacts.com. All right, anyone else? Questions? Boy, you're such an easy audience. Yes, sir.
Have you heard of the book, The Ringmakers of Saturn?
The Ringmakers of Saturn. I have heard of that for some reason, but I can't comment beyond the idea that I know that they've probably got something in orbit around Saturn and that they've imaged something in the rings of Saturn.
Yeah.
So I can only speculate that there's probably a secret space program presence today that's much further along than what we see with just NASA, and that could be part of that. Yes, sir.
You mentioned earlier that would you say that our scientists characterize Sirius as already as a binary star system with Sirius A and Sirius B being binary?
No, they don't. And when I put it in that,
Because then that would make this a trinary.
right.
Okay.
Right. No, what I'm doing is considering Sirius as a star system in its total encapsulation, and that we're in an orbit around that. But yes, it has its own star system, meaning Sirius A or B could have planets around them which possibly have life.
And to your knowledge, in scientific data, do there exist trinary solar systems?
There are definitely many binary systems that are beyond just 2 suns. I've seen some up to 6 suns in very intricate dance.
Okay. I can't help but think of the idea, as above, so below. If you look at a nucleus and the electrons going around.
Of course.
And some of them have a charge where they want to release from one of the fields or one of the orbits, they're looking to release an electron or gain one.
Right.
If you take that archetype or that idea, that theme, that can play out on a larger scale.
Totally.
And like you said, these scales of ages, that a solar system, maybe think of it as an electron.
Microcosm, macrocosm.
Right. And then,
very good point.
And at certain times, it wants to release one, or one is looking for a mate, as they say, and then create something new once it matches.
That's a good way to look at it. Yeah, thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Not so complex. I'm just curious if you happen to know the answer to this, why the moon is rising at 2:30 in the morning. And I noticed that the constellations look different than I've noticed. I'm 55 and I've been looking at the skies for a long time,
Sure.
and they don't look the same as they have in the past. They look different right now. And I'm just like, I'm not the only one who noticed it. I drive Uber and I ask my I'm like, hey, there's
I don't know.
coming up at this time, and why?
I don't know. I mean, as I've said, the ancients went to a great degree to track daily watching, and at a simple term, I could just kind of give you an idea of how the ancients would do this. They could go out every day before the sun would rise, the time of heliochal rising, and if you could see whatever the constellation the sun is rising in front of, we'd be in the age of Aquarius or the age of Pisces. So they had some very interesting ways of observing every day, like you might be doing. But I don't know of any information currently being put forth that there's, let's say some weird changes or views taking place.
Well, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I just saw this thing on Facebook on YouTube where instead of our sun being stationary and everything turning around that
Right.
there was the one hurling through space and everything was flying behind it.
Yes, and I kind of showed something similar in
Yeah.
the beginning of my lecture, which is the idea that our solar system could be in motion rather than stagnant. And I do support the idea that our sun, rather than sitting in space with the planets moving, is moving through space while the planets are also orbiting.
Would that be why our constellation changes?
That's exactly what I'm saying, is I
Yeah.
support the idea that it's not a lunar solar wobble and that we're degrading the orbit 1 degree every 72 years,
Right.
that we're actually moving through space, and that's why we have a changed view of the North Star every 2,000 years. It's a very complex topic, but yes, that's
Maybe
definitely
you
one
would
of the
know the
points.
answer to why the moon rises at 2:30 in the morning.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, folks, a couple other questions? Sure, one more, go ahead. Two more.
We may want to take into consideration using empirical evidence from our own experience, let's say with the amount of advancement in technology that we've had just in the last 100 years. If Planet Nibiru was here 3,600 years ago, and they already had high technology where they're are using rocket ships, whatever the case may be.
Yep.
That in the next orbit of 3,600 years, they may have advanced in 3,600 years to a point where they may be able to steer the ship or drive the car.
Right.
And not like we're on a runaway car with our mothership. Earth.
No, it's
But
a
they
good
may
point.
be able to now, 3,600 years later, have the capability now,
That makes sense.
hopefully,
They're
to
going to
drive
keep
the car
advancing.
and avoid a collision with her.
Sure.
I just thought I'd throw that out.
Well, you made me think of one thought, and I'll try and get it out there really quickly, but go ahead and answer your
Two
question.
things, Jason, thanks for coming here and sharing your knowledge.
My pleasure.
Well documented. Number two, there seems to be a lot of talk about this astrological effect that's going to take place in late September. They talk about the Virgin with the stars over giving birth to Jupiter in her womb.
I'm not aware of that.
You're not aware of that? Okay. I didn't know if you heard any information or what your thoughts were on that.
No, it's okay. I would recommend there is a video called Zeitgeist that doesn't really touch on that, but it does put out some very interesting pieces of information that can kind of change some of the perspectives of the idea of some of these great figures that we've had throughout time being celebrated and being in alignment with an astronomical cycle. I think I was going to say something based on what you were going to say, and I forgot my point, so it's okay. If there's no other questions, I think I'm going to go ahead and end it there for the evening. I know we've got a couple other panels going on, so please enjoy your stay at the conference this weekend. Thank you.
Can we give it up again one more time for Jason Martell?